I'd like to announce that after this talk there will be coffee and donuts and Sigma Xi special cider out in the room right out the back of the door and the way it'll be to your right. That door out there. It's a real pleasure to introduce Emery Block Lovins. He resigned as a junior research fellowship of Merton College in Oxford in 1971 to be British representative of Friends of the Earth Incorporated. This is a U.S. nonprofit conservation group. He's a consultant physicist, mainly consulting in the United States, but throughout the world since 1965. He now concentrates on energy and resource strategy, which he'll be speaking to us tonight about. His current or recent clients include OECD, some UN agencies, the International Federation of Institutes for Advanced Study, the MIT Workshop on Alternative Energy Strategies, the Science Council of Canada, Petro-Canada, U.S. ERDA, U.S. Office of Technology Assessment, Resources for the Future, and other organizations in several countries. During 1977 to 78, that's last year, he was Regents Lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. He's active in all sorts of international energy affairs, has testified before Parliament, congressional committees, talked to governors' conferences in many states, and is broadcast extensively. I think you'll see him tomorrow on, where is that? On radio or TV?
I guess tomorrow night on Mary Jane Odell at 6:30.
6:30, Mary Jane Odell. You can hear him. And he has published six.
It was tonight.
Well, it'll be tomorrow night too. It's a serial, two sections. He's published 6 books, several monographs, and numerous technical papers, articles, and reviews. It's a great deal of pleasure. I'd like to introduce Emery Lovins. The title of his talk is Why Do It the Hard Way? Alternative Energy Technologies.
Thank you. I've spent most of my time for the past few years running around the international energy grapevine and cross-pollinating. And in the process, I've noticed a lot of people converging on a hopeful view of our energy future, which I'd like to help you explore by outlining 2 ways our energy system might evolve over the next 50 years or so. These 2 paths are hypothetical and illustrative. Although I think they're technically realistic, they're not intended as precise forecasts or recommendations, but rather as a qualitative vehicle for ideas. I'm going to be using U.S. examples just to be familiar and specific, but studies on these lines are done or being done in about 50 jurisdictions around the world, including over a dozen countries, and the data already in are showing very clearly that although the technical details differ from one country to another, and indeed within a country or state as diverse as this one, the same principles apply essentially anywhere. I'm also going to be quite selective in drawing on a wide range of information because the basic thesis has already been set out in a book called Soft Energy Paths. And if you really want to dig into the literature, there's a nice paperweight put out by the U.S. Senate Small Business and Interior Committees called Alternative Long-Range Energy Strategies. This contains virtually all of the 30-odd published critiques with responses and supplements. There are also some more recent technical papers out. Because all that's available, I'd like to resist, at least till our discussion, the temptation to get into some of the more seductive technical details and to concentrate instead on some fundamental concepts. Until maybe a year or 2 ago, there was a strong industry government consensus, remnants of which linger, that the energy future should be like the past, only more so, and that the energy problem is simply how to expand domestic supplies to meet extrapolated demands. Treating the demands, though, as homogeneous, as aggregated numbers. We will need so many total quads of energy in the year X, and not looking particularly at their structure. If you were to make up a composite of the main elements of that consensus as of a year or two ago, it might look something like this. A policy of strength through exhaustion, in which we push very hard on all of the depletable fuels we can find and convert them into premium energy forms, fluid fuels and especially electricity, in ever larger, more complex, more centralized plants. Now, without tying my argument to the illustrative numbers shown here, which nowadays look a little high, I'd like to suggest that this qualitative pattern doesn't work, not only for logistical and political reasons, but also for economic reasons. And those show up very clearly if you ask how much capital you have to invest to increase delivered energy supplies by the heat equivalent of 1 barrel of oil per day. As you go from the traditional direct fuel systems on which our economy has been built to Arctic and offshore oil and gas and synthetic fuels from coal or oil shale, the capital intensity goes up roughly tenfold. And as we go from those systems in turn to the central electric systems, the capital intensity goes up about another tenfold. It's that roughly 100-fold increase in capital intensity that makes it impossible for any major country outside the Persian Gulf to use these big high technologies, especially the electric ones, on a truly large scale, that is large enough to substitute for oil and gas. They're just so expensive, they're starting to look a bit like future technologies whose time has passed. They are, however, also just the technologies on which the hard energy path, as I'll call it, relies for most of its growth. So it's not surprising that in a typical case, the first 10 years of such a program, up to 1985, would require an investment in energy of over $1 trillion constant dollars, 3/4 of it for electrification. That $1 trillion implies in turn that we would be putting into the energy sector its present quarter of all of our discretionary investment, plus about 2/3 of all the rest. And if we could figure out a way to do that, we clearly would not have enough money left to build the things that were supposed to use all that energy. The further up this kind of curve we went, the heavier the burden would become. Now, these astronomical investments would give us electricity coming out of our ears, but it would substitute only slowly and imperfectly for oil and gas, especially in transportation, so we would still be seriously short of them. And even worse, out of all of the enormous energy growth over these 50 years, more than half would never get to the final users. It would be lost first in conversion and distribution as the efficiency of the whole fuel chain went steadily down. Putting these billion-dollar blocks of capital into things that take about 10 years to build would tend to make inflation worse, utility finance unstable, and unemployment worse by stagnating capital instead of turning it around fast. In fact, every big power station we built would directly and indirectly lose the economy of the order of 4,000 net jobs just by siphoning capital away from other sectors. It appears then that this approach would make our economic problems worse, not better. At the same time, I think it would create some serious political problems. To start with, just to get these resources into the energy sector would require a strong central authority working outside the market, perhaps something on the lines of the War Production Board, which Mr. Rockefeller keeps proposing under various names. And then, once we had built these big complex technologies, I presume we would need big complex bureaucracies to run them and to allocate their output. Because these energy systems are centralized, they would automatically allocate the energy and the side effects or the social costs of getting it to different groups of people at opposite ends of the transmission lines, pipelines, rail lines. It's the old story where the energy goes to Boswash and Los Angeles and Chicago, while the side effects go to Appalachia, Wyoming, Navajo country, the North Slope, an arrangement that's considered admirable at one end and unjust at the other. We already have over 60 energy wars going on around the country, conflicts between central siting authorities or utilities and local, mainly politically weak agrarian people who don't want to live in a zone of national sacrifice for the benefit of somebody 1,000 miles away. This is already a formidable political constraint to this kind of program. It's also worrying, I think, that these increasingly centralized systems would be increasingly vulnerable to disruption by accident or malice, especially the electric systems, which can be turned off by just a few people. The past 11 years I've been living in England, where we're turned off fairly often. If you don't like being turned off, you may need some stringent social controls. It's also very hard just to make political decisions about technologies with compulsory perceived hazards that are exotic, disputed, unknown, maybe unknowable. And governments faced with decisions of that kind are very tempted to substitute we the experts for we the people, elitist technocracy for democratic process. That's gratifying for the experts, but it may also lead to a loss of legitimacy. Over all of these domestic political problems, which are certainly serious enough, looms a larger threat of nuclear violence and coercion in a world where we're told a couple of decades from now we're supposed to have some tens of thousands of bombs worth a year of strategic material running around as an item of commerce within the same international community that's never been able to stop the heroin traffic. Now, these are some of the simple, direct, you might say first-order side effects of this approach to the energy problem. And yet they in turn interact with each other to make new higher-order side effects, which together suggest, I think, that the cheap and abundant energy at which this policy is aimed is not really cheap at all. We're just paying for it everywhere else. Maybe I should spin that out a minute, because even those of us who should know better often tend, I think, to treat energy too much in isolation. Suppose we think, for example, that energy ought to be cheap. So we continue to spend tens of billions of dollars a year of your tax money subsidizing it to make it look cheap. Well, if we think it's cheap, we will continue to use it wastefully and to import lots of oil, which is bad for the dollar and our independence, and worse for Europe and Japan, and disastrous for the third world. That much, I think, is generally known. Let's follow the argument a little further, though. We then have to earn the money to pay for the oil. Traditionally, we've done this in three main ways. One is to run down domestic stocks of commodities. That's inflationary. It leaves big holes in the ground. It leaves the forest looking kind of moth-eaten. Another way is to export weapons. That's inflationary and destabilizing and immoral. Another is to export things like wheat and soybeans. And however you might feel about this as a local economic issue, I think looked at more broadly, it's not quite an unmixed blessing. It turns the Midwestern land markets upside down. It makes us mine soil in Iowa and mine groundwater in West Kansas. Those will catch up with us. We then export, say, some of the wheat to the Russians, and we divert some of their investment from agriculture into military activities. So we have to raise our own military budget. That's inflationary. We have to do that anyway to defend the sea lanes to bring in the oil and to defend the Israelis from all those arms we just sold to the Arabs. If you follow that argument very far, you discover that maybe the best kind of Middle Eastern arms control might be American roof insulation. Because the wheat and soybeans are becoming important to our oil balance of trade, we feel driven to ever more energy and water and capital-intensive chemical agribusiness, which does in some of the natural life support systems and burns out the soil faster. We then feel driven to still more fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, desalination, irrigation. It's just a vicious circle. Meanwhile, back in the cities, because we think this energy is cheap, we've been substituting it disproportionately for human skills, displacing people with black boxes, aided, of course, by taxes on employment and subsidies to capital. The economists call this process increasing labor productivity, or productivity for short, and they mean by that the productivity of people who have not yet been displaced. They then tell us that we need more of these black boxes to fuel the economic growth that they say we need to employ the people whom we've just disemployed by this very process. At any rate, clearly when we replace people with black boxes, we increase poverty and inequity and alienation and crime, and we then try to spend money on things like crime control and health care, only we can't because we spent the money already on the energy sector, which is contributing to the unemployment and illness at which those investments were aimed. At home, we drift gradually towards a garrison state, trying to protect ourselves from some of these homemade vulnerabilities. Abroad, we strengthen oil and uranium cartels. We don't address rational development goals. In fact, we compete with our trading partners to see who can export the most reactors and weapons and inflation to the third world. These things all rightly encourage international distrust and domestic dissent, which entail further suspicion and repression. Meanwhile, we're also burning all these fossil fuels, putting a lot of gunk like carbon dioxide into the air, running the risk of destabilizing the climate on which marginal agriculture depends. For example, here in the Midwestern breadbasket, on which by this point everyone's depending for exported food. Meanwhile, we're also spreading bombs all over the place. The list goes on like that, but I think if you start to add up these kinds of side effects and ask yourself, how do they interact with each other? What do the third order effects look like? Then it becomes clear that you wouldn't really want to live there. And if, as proponents of this view tell us, there were no alternative to it, then the human prospect would indeed be bleak. There'd be no object in what we're doing in universities. The only useful skill to have, I suppose, would be knowing how to dig very deep holes and pull them in after us. I think there is, however, quite a different way we can look at the energy problem that leads us in a nicer direction. It's also more interesting. I'll call it a soft energy path. It might look, for example, something like this. And it has three main technical components, which I'll take in turn, namely using much more efficiently the energy we've got, getting it increasingly from soft technologies, which I'll define presently, and intelligently using fossil fuels for a transition. But this path is distinguished from the hard energy path not by how much energy we use, and not only by our choices of equipment, but primarily by their very different political and structural implications. That is, the definition of hard and soft paths rests more on political economy than on mere hardware, and I'll return to that point later. These two paths also reflect two quite different views of what the energy problem is. In the hard path, there's a tacit assumption that the more energy we use, the better off we are. Energy is tacitly elevated from a means to an end in itself. Whereas in the soft path, how much energy we use to accomplish our social goals is considered a measure not of our success, but of our failure. Just as if you wanted to get someplace, how much traffic you had to endure to get there wouldn't measure how well off you are, although it might measure, say, our failure to have a sensible settlement pattern in which you're already near where you want to be. The energy problem, then, that a soft path is addressing is not just how to expand domestic supplies to meet projected homogeneous demands. It starts at the other end of the problem. It starts by asking, what are our heterogeneous end-use needs? What are the many different tasks we're trying to do with the energy? And how can we do those tasks with a minimum, with an elegant frugality, if you like, of energy, supplied in the most effective way for each task? This emphasis on what's the job, what's the best tool for the job, which is really the classic criterion of good engineering, leads, as you'll see, to quite a different impression of what kinds of new energy supply makes sense. Now, let me run quickly through these three technical elements of a soft path, starting with end-use efficiency. That is, how much work can we wring from each unit of energy that's delivered to us? There's so much good technical work published on this that I can just state flatly that in practice, we can roughly double this end-use efficiency by the turn of the century, roughly redouble it over the next quarter century or so, and still have a ways to go entirely through technical fixes. That is, measures which are now economic by normal criteria, use today's or more often 1870s technologies, and have no significant effect on lifestyles. Simple-minded things like plugging up the square meter of holes in your house, insulating, recovering waste heat in buildings and industry, cogenerating electricity in factories as a byproduct of processed steam, making car engines that are more efficient, and so on. Now, the reason I've shown the curve of total energy needs as turning downwards later in the 50-year period is that as we dig into some of the slow capital stocks, especially buildings, it becomes possible to increase the technical efficiency of using energy faster than growth in what we're doing with the energy. I have assumed here orthodox projections of rapid growth in economic activity, population, comfort, equity. I have not assumed any significant changes in lifestyles, settlement patterns, composition of GNP, patterns of political organization. If you happen to feel, as I'm told some people do, that today's values or institutions are imperfect, then of course you're welcome to assume some mixture of technical and social changes which will make all this a lot easier, but I haven't done that. I have carefully and with some difficulty kept my personal preferences separate from my analytic assumptions. I happen to think that classical ideas of unlimited economic growth are spherically senseless. That is, they make no sense no matter how you look at them, but I've assumed them anyway just to save argument. And indeed, I very much underestimated the scope for purely technical improvements in the efficiency of using energy. To emphasize that point, because those of us right in the middle of the energy business often don't realize how fast the ground's been shifting under our feet lately, I made up a little sociological matrix showing how much energy various people have projected that this country would need in the year 2000, measured in crazy units called quads per year. We now use about 75 quads per year, and classified according to when the forecast was made and by whom it was made. One of the Huxleys said that it's the fate of all knowledge to start as heresy and end as superstition. So I have those categories with conventional wisdom in between. And besides conventional wisdom, I have a pre-heretical phase called Beyond the Pale, which means people don't even bother to read it. So reading through those from left to right, back before the embargo, people like me were saying that 125 quads would be ample in the year 2000. I think John Holdren at Berkeley was even below 100, which was beyond the pale. The Sierra Club was up around 140, the Atomic Energy Commission about 160, Interior and the Federal Power Commission about 190. Somebody told me Exxon was up around 230. That's all pretty ambitious compared to 75 today. Then came the embargo and the Ford Energy Policy Project, whose 100 quad scenario wasn't taken very seriously, but their 124 technical fix was, because it was a lot lower than ERDA's 140 or the utilities 160 odd. Then two years ago, in Foreign Affairs and in the graph you've just seen, I was suggesting that 95 quads would be ample in 2000. In talks, I was saying 75 made better use of the technical fixes we'd already discovered. Some Princeton analysts came up in between with a solid 89. By then, ERDA had come down to 124. They discovered technical fixes. Edison Electric Institute had come down to 140. They discovered price elasticity. Here we are in 1978, and John Steinhardt at Wisconsin is talking about 33 quads for the year 2050. If you read Science magazine April 14th, you'll have seen the very distinguished demand panel of the National Academy CONEA study giving some scenarios for the year 2010. Including 63 quads, which could have been a pure technical fix, 77 and 96, which were. Alvin Weinberg at Oak Ridge is happy with 101. Ralph Lapp, who believes energy and GNP march in lockstep, is happy with 124. This matrix even has some predictive power. About a month ago, the Department of Energy came out with its latest forecasts, ranging from 95 quads, which seems to be squarely in the conventional wisdom box, to an average of 123, which is over in the superstition column. What I'd like to point out, though, is that this is a diagonal matrix. Every 2 years, things are popping down into the next column with clock-like regularity, and we haven't anywhere near hit bottom yet. For example, we only just discovered that if we had a really energy-conscious materials policy, we would roughly treble our national energy efficiency, but we didn't even know that, so it isn't in any of these numbers. Well, so much for end-use efficiency. Clearly, if our long-term energy needs are going to be about the present level or a bit below, rather than soaring forever upwards, we can do a lot more faster with soft technologies than we thought we could. And I define soft energy technologies by 5 specific properties. First of all, they're diverse. There are dozens of kinds, each used to do what it does best, not trying to be a panacea. Secondly, they're renewable. They run on sun, wind, water, farm and forestry residues, not on depletable fuels. Third, they're relatively simple and understandable from the user's point of view, but they can still be technically very sophisticated. For example, this pocket calculator is an extremely high-technology device. I don't think I could make one. I don't quite know what goes on in there. But what I most care about as a user is that this calculator is a tool, not a machine. I run it. It doesn't run me. It's not some mysterious giant lurking over the horizon and presided over by a technological priesthood. That's the kind of social criterion I have in mind under this third point. And fourth and fifth, soft technologies supply energy at the appropriate scale and quality for our range of end-use needs. I'd like to amplify those 2 very important points in turn, and let me start with scale. We are often told that energy systems must be enormous to be affordable, and there often are some real economies of scale in construction. But there are also some equally real diseconomies of large scale which we just haven't counted before. For example, if you build a power station, gas plant, refinery, or whatever to be bigger, more centralized, you then have to buy a bigger, costlier distribution network to spread out the energy again to dispersed users. We've got to the point in this country with electricity in '72 or with gas last year, where if you're an average residential customer, something like 29 cents of your utility bill dollar is actually paying to buy energy. The other 71 cents pays for getting it delivered to you. That's a diseconomy of centralization. Secondly, some of the energy gets lost along the way. Third, if we could mass produce power stations the way we do cars, for example, they'd cost at least 10 times less than they do, but we can't because they're too big. And that also makes it very hard to use total energy systems, where we could sell waste heat and save a lot of money in fuel. Fourth, there are some direct diseconomies of large scale, which show up if you look at this sample, let's say, showing half of all the thermal power stations commissioned in this country in a recent 2-year period. And you can see that as the plants got bigger, the fraction of the time they didn't work also got bigger. It went up from about 10 to about 35%, for very good technical reasons that aren't going to go away. In fact, it's even worse than that, because if one of these big 1,000-megawatt stations dies on you, it's embarrassing. It's kind of like having an elephant die in the drawing room, and you have to have your standby elephant of 1,000 megawatts or so ready to haul the carcass away. That is, you need a lot of standby or backup capacity, commonly known in the trade as reserve margin. And if indeed, instead of building the 1,000-megawatt station and letting all that backup sit there and eat interest, you were to build several smaller stations of a few hundred megawatts each. In a typical grid, that saving in reserve margin just from the change in unit size, because the several smaller stations probably wouldn't all fail at the same time, that saving would let you provide the same level and reliability of service with about 1/3 less new capacity. Congratulations, you just saved $300 million. Indeed, if you went to, say, 10-megawatt units at the substation, you could probably get by with a factor of 2 or 2.5 less new capacity to do the same job, just from the backup saving. So we have some direct diseconomies of large scale in unreliability and a large need for reserve margin. But then there are some indirect diseconomies, which show up if you look at how much capital you have to invest to install a kilowatt of capacity at various plant sizes. And on classical economy of scale theories, it should go straight like that. In other words, the bigger the plant, the cheaper per kilowatt. But actually something funny is going on. It's costing us less to install a kilowatt in a small plant than in a very big one. And I suspect what may be happening there is that the small plant is so much faster to build that it protects you from exposure to interest, cost escalation, premature completion, changes in regulatory requirements during construction. It gives you a low inertia, low risk investment in a time of rapid technical and social change. Now, there are some other even more interesting diseconomies of large scale. For example, there are all of the political costs I mentioned earlier, and I would emphasize particularly vulnerability or brittleness or lack of resilience as a national security issue. There's no point having armed forces if half a dozen people can come in and shut you down. Then there's increased local social and environmental stress around the site of a big unit, so it's harder to find a site. Therefore, when the utility, say, gets a site, it will try to pack as much capacity onto that site as possible. Then the plant is a worse neighbor than it would have been otherwise. There's a political reaction to that. Transaction costs for the next site go up, and so on exponentially. We're well into that loop. And it then becomes possible to make really big mistakes. In the East, we call this the Con Ed syndrome. We are meanwhile encouraging oligopoly because small business can't make big machines. What we're doing is less relevant to the needs of most of the people in the world. The personal responsibility of technologists diminishes and may even slip through the cracks as policy passes into the hands of big promotional constituencies. And anyway, as Freeman Dyson points out, big systems are less fun to do and too big for technologists to play with. So they may not be as innovative as they would be with smaller, simpler, more accessible things that a lot of people can tinker with. One of the great strengths of the soft technologies. Now, I happen to think all of these effects are real and important. But if you believe in counting only what's readily countable, then you'll probably just count the first 5 on the list, and let me just count the first 2, just the costs and losses of distribution, and then do a little economics. I was brought up as a high technologist, and I therefore always assumed that although soft technologies were nice, they would cost more. Well, I then started doing some conservative calculations based on empirical cost and performance data from good technology, shopping around for the best buy in each category. And conservatively calculating costs in that way, I discovered to my astonishment that actually soft technologies are cheaper than hard technologies to do the same jobs. Heat exchangers that recover the heat or cool escaping in the outgoing air and water and recycle them into the incoming air and water, so you don't have to start from scratch making that heat or cool. Well, when you've done that and your net heating load is down in the range of a few hundred watts, in most parts of the country you won't need any heat. In Iowa, you would. Well, where do you get it? The cheapest place to get it is a passive solar retrofit. Put a greenhouse on the south side of your house. That works just as well as a flat plate, maybe better, and costs a lot less. The next cheapest place to get your heat is a completely solar, seasonal storage, active solar system on a neighborhood scale, solar district heating. The next cheapest place to get your heat is to put up good field-erected flat plate collectors on your roof with enough storage so you don't need any backup, but just do the solar one house at a time, which is the most expensive way. Interestingly, if you shop around for a good solar system, that investment for solar heat will be less than half what you would otherwise have to pay for a very efficient nuclear-powered heat pump system to heat the same house. It will also be less than you would otherwise have to pay for a synthetic gas and furnace system to heat the same house. And so on, whether you're talking about low or high temperature heat, portable liquid fuels for vehicles, or even electricity, although the soft technologies are not cheap, they're cheaper than not having them. They may or may not be cheaper than present oil and gas. Some are, some aren't. But what matters is that they're a lot cheaper than what you'd otherwise have to do to replace today's oil and gas. You notice I'm comparing all these alternatives in the same table. And I'll do that later with energy price, which is really the consumer's bottom line. Well, that gets around a little shell game which most official reports play with energy costs. Every Department of Energy report on this subject likes to compare with each other in cost the things the department likes to build, like synthetic gas plants versus power stations. And then when it comes to the things that they traditionally haven't been so excited about, like solar heating, they'll compare its cost not with the competing hard technologies, but instead with the historically cheap and heavily subsidized oil and gas, which all these systems are meant to replace, thus demanding of soft technologies and conservation and economic performance which the hard technologies fail by a much wider margin to deliver. Or to put it more bluntly, the Department of Energy is rejecting as uneconomic right now the more expensive kinds of solar heat at, say, $20 or $25 per barrel oil equivalent, because that's more than $15 oil. At the same time they do that, they're proposing out of your pocket the most lavish and bizarre subsidies for turkeys like synthetic gas at $40 a barrel or nuclear electricity at $100 a barrel. That's obviously nuts, or more formally, it leads to a misallocation. What we ought to be doing is to compare all of our alternative investments with each other, not compare some with each other and some with the cheap oil and gas. And when we do that, we discover that by far the cheapest things to do are the efficiency improvements, then the soft and transitional technologies, then the synthetic fuels, and most expensive by far, even with heat pumps, are the electric systems. Now, that doesn't mean that if you decide not to build some turkey like Vandalia, you should then go look for another way to send out big blocks of electricity. That's not the point. What you're really interested in is how best to meet the end-use needs that you would have met with the oil and gas if you had them in the first place. And it was because they were running out that you were thinking of building more power stations. Well, that brings me to the fifth and perhaps most important part of the definition of soft technologies, that they should supply energy in the right quality for the job. What do we want the energy for? I don't have the Iowa numbers. I don't think anyone else does either. That's a little disturbing, and I hope somebody will work them out. But I think it won't be far off the national average, which looks like this, that at the point of end use, 58% of our energy needs today are for heat, mostly at low temperatures. In fact, 35% of the total is for heat below the boiling point of water, and half the total is for heat below about 600 Celsius, which is within the convenient solar range. So 58% of our needs are for heat, another 34% for portable liquid fuels for vehicles, and a total of only 8% represents all of the premium uses that need electricity and that can give us our money's worth out of this very special, expensive kind of energy. In Iowa, you're paying anywhere from 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is $65 a barrel equivalent, to maybe 7 odd cents a kilowatt hour, which is well over $100 per barrel equivalent for your electricity. It's very expensive stuff. It's a very special, expensive, high-quality kind of energy. New electricity will certainly cost the equivalent of over $100 per barrel heat equivalent. Not exactly what you'd want to heat your house with, because that's 7 times the world oil price. Now, if you were going to use it to run electronics, lights, motors, smelters, electroplating, special uses that need electricity, you might be willing to pay that kind of price, but those special uses are only 8% of the total and are already long since filled up, because we have today not 8, but 13% supplied as electricity, with more on the way. And the difference, the extra 5, is already going, as more would have to go if we made more, inappropriately to be used in low-grade heating and cooling. And using electricity that way is kind of like cutting butter with a chainsaw. It's inelegant and expensive and messy and dangerous and bad for chainsaws. Let me reiterate this point, because it's really the one from which the whole soft path logic flows. Our energy supply problem is overwhelmingly, 92%, a problem of heat and of portable liquid fuels for vehicles. More electricity is not a sensible response to that problem, because it's too slow and much too expensive. Therefore, arguing about what kind of power station to build, which is much of what passes for energy policy these days, is completely irrelevant. It's like debating the Best Buy in Champaign when all you really want is a drink of water. Now, we can do a little thought experiment. If we took this 8% that really needs electricity and we cut out the pure waste, at least 2 of that 8% is lighting offices at headache level and similarly silly pursuits, and if we then use the remaining electricity efficiently in ways that are now cost effective, we would end up shrinking it to less than 3%. That is, to such a small number, of the order of 1/5 of our present electricity use, that we could cover it nationally with our present hydro capacity, the readily available microhydro using existing small dams, and a bit of wind power, but no thermal power stations of any kind. And that thought experiment shows you, I think, how far out of step we are with the economically efficient ideal of supplying energy only in the quality needed for the task at hand. Now, if we were to do that, we could largely eliminate the costs and losses of further converting the energy. It would already be in the right form. And if we supplied it at the right scale for each task, we could largely eliminate the costs and losses of distributing it. It would be already where we wanted it. Those two kinds of losses, conversion and distribution losses, dominate the growth in a hard energy path. They make the primary fuels that we toss into the hopper run away from the delivered end-use energy, and all the space in between, over half the growth, is conversion and distribution losses that don't do you any good. Whereas in the soft path, we would gradually squeeze out most of those losses, and at the same time, because we'd be getting several times as much work out of each unit of energy that was delivered to us, the bottom dashed line here, which I've called functions performed, that is, delivered goods and services, what you really care about, that would end up higher than in a hard path, even though we were using less energy. We'd be doing more with less. Now, we have lately had, especially in the past year or two, extraordinarily rapid technical progress, especially outside the official programs, in developing a wide range of soft technologies. And in an article coming out this month in Annual Review of Energy, Volume 3, I've shown that if you take the soft technologies that are today in or entering commercial service, that is, things that are now here, and you don't need a lot more R&D to get them, and if you add them up, they're more than enough to meet our end-use needs. When I say we've got enough soft technologies already, I'm not assuming any solar electric technologies, which is what the utilities talk about when they say solar isn't here yet. I'm not assuming cheap solar cells, which we will obviously have before we know what to do with them. Some people think we have them already. I'm not assuming presently commercial Rankine heat engines, which hooked to solar ponds appear to be the cheapest known source of baseload power. Those things will be along, they'll be convenient, but we don't actually need them. So when I say we've got enough soft technologies, all I'm assuming is the present best art in active and passive solar heating, solar process heat for industry, converting farm and forestry wastes to liquid fuels, especially alcohols, for efficient vehicles, present hydro, microhydro, and a bit of wind, in some places for electricity, but more often for water pumping, heat pumping, compressing air to drive machinery. I think if we add up the best art now available in all of these and use each one to do what it does best, they're more than enough for us or even for countries like Japan and Denmark, which are the first ones I looked at. And yet, even though we've got all these systems, it'll take a long time to get them all in place. It might take about 50 years because the energy system is so big and sluggish, it takes about that long to do anything. So we will certainly need to buy that time by briefly and sparingly using fossil fuels to build a bridge. And we should use them cleanly in ways that it's easy to plug the soft technologies into during the transition. There's a nice example in Enköping, Sweden, where there's a commercial district heating station containing a fluidized bed boiler, which will surpass our strictest air quality standards, burning high sulfur coal, rather like Iowa coal with no scrubbers. It will also burn any kind of oil, gas, wood, peat, trash, energy studies, it doesn't care. they've designed the district heating grid of insulated hot water pipes around town in such a way that it can later be easily converted to seasonal storage solar district heating, which costs only half as much as solar heating one building at a time. In fact, it's such a good deal it appears to compete with $8 a barrel oil right now. I think that with such methods and with only a modest and temporary expansion of coal mining, not entailing significant western stripping, we could squeeze down this oil and gas wedge from both sides, getting off the OPEC hook faster and leaving a lot of frontier oil and gas in the ground where they can't get into mischief. We'd be doing this not by wiping the slate clean, but by starting where we are, doing different things from now on, replacing inappropriate capital stocks through normal attrition. Not by abolishing big technologies, but by saying that they've got an important place which they've already filled up, and we can take advantage of the ones we've got, like the electric grid, without expanding them further. This is in no sense an anti-technology program. It involves, I think, some very exciting technical challenges, but of a different and to some of us an unfamiliar kind, that is, making things that are sophisticated in their simplicity, not in their complexity. Now, my reason for setting up these two paths was to draw some comparisons. They were a vehicle for ideas. So let me start with comparing them in cost. I've already suggested the soft path is a lot cheaper in capital cost. It has an even greater advantage in delivered energy price, typically a factor of 3 or so. If, for example, you look at conservative empirical calculations for low temperature heat, which is over a third of our end-use needs and probably more than that in Iowa, you find the cheap sources of heat in dollars per barrel or per million BTU roughly are conservation and passive solar. The next cheapest is solar district heating, and then neck and neck with the depletable subsidized fuels, oil and gas, we have active solar heating for a single building. But if you don't do that, you're stuck with synthetic gas. The DOE numbers are closer to $40 a barrel, or with electricity, and even with a heat pump more efficient than anything you can buy, the electricity would not be a good deal. Even if, by the way, you did want more electricity for some reason, there are presently commercial places to get it that are a good deal cheaper than central stations. I think a soft path is not only cheaper than a hard path, it's also quicker. That is, per dollar invested, it will give you more energy and money and jobs back faster. There are 3 main reasons why a soft path is relatively fast. One reason is that the things you're building in a soft path each have a construction time typically measured in days, weeks, or months, not 10 years. Secondly, they sell into a vastly larger market, 100 million households, not a few thousand utilities. They're things that look a little more like CB radios or snowmobiles or pocket calculators than they look like basic oxygen furnaces or reactors. And they spread into this enormously greater market more by spontaneous technical diffusion than by a specialized process of technology delivery. It's a completely different business to be in. Thirdly, the soft technologies are diverse and each is held back by different problems. Microhydro is held back by regulatory hassles, whereas, say, passive solar is held back by the need to retread architects and builders. But those are 2 different problems. And because they're independent, and others like them are independent, you can envisage several dozen relatively slowly growing wedges, each held back by different problems, but through their independence, adding up by sheer strength of numbers to very rapid total growth. It's not at all the same game as having a few monolithic technologies held back by the same constraints everywhere at once. The risk of technical failure is like a lot lower if you spread it among dozens of fairly simple things known to work than if you put all your bets on big coal gas plants and breeders which are not here and might or might not work. The soft path is environmentally a lot more benign, and it hedges our bets on the important climatic problems like CO2 by getting out of the whole fossil fuel business as fast as possible. A soft path is well suited not only to urban and industrial societies, but also to modern development concepts. For example, if you look at empirical data on 2 ways to make nitrogen fertilizer in India at a given rate, you find one way is to build a single Western-style fertilizer plant. Another way is to build 26,000-odd village-scale Gobar gas plants. Those turn out to have a lower total capital cost, half that much with the Chinese technology, zero foreign exchange drain, over 100 times more jobs in a country with a labor surplus and a capital shortage. And instead of being a net energy consumer, they're such a copious net producer of methane that they can meet virtually all of the cooking, lighting, and pumping needs of the village. That is half of all the energy needs in India right now. What's happening now, of course, is that the dung is being burned as a cooking fuel in open fires. So all the nitrogen and most of the heat are going up in smoke, which blinds people. Whereas in this case, you get out a better fertilizer than you started with, plus this clean and efficient gaseous fuel. You break the cycle of firewood shortage, deforestation, erosion. Clearly, these Gobar gas plants are an example of a very powerful development tool, which is why China has installed about 5 million biogas plants in the past 6 years. There's another important geopolitical side effect of a soft path. That is that it offers this country, I think, the political leverage to promote a world psychological climate of denuclearization, in which it comes to be viewed as a mark of national immaturity to have or want either reactors or bombs. What gives us this leverage is that the world nuclear enterprise is rapidly turning into a pumpkin. This remarkable graph shows the range of official projections for how much nuclear capacity the U.S. was supposed to have installed in the year 2000 as a function of when the government made the projections. And you see it's dropping so fast that by linear extrapolation it should hit zero around the end of this year. In practice, it'll come to rest somewhere between zero if the plants are phased out and 120-odd, 130-odd gigawatts if they're not. That is, if the net reactor ordering rate, which has been going more and more negative for the past 3 years, were miraculously to come up to zero so that everything in the pipeline came dribbling out, then in the year 2000, U.S. nuclear power would be down here in the firewood league, representing somewhat under 3% of our present total delivered energy use. Now, you might think this is an American political eccentricity, but when you plot the same graph for Canada, which has a completely different kind of reactor and has had so far none of our regulatory problems, they don't even have hearings, the graphs are so identical you cannot tell them apart. That tells me that it's a market effect. Fans of Adam Smith might say the invisible fist strikes again. And indeed, if you plot the same graph for Germany, France, Japan, Britain, any nuclear country of note, you get the same graph with minor variations of slope for the same basic economic reasons. Now that means the nuclear power is not going to amount to a hill of beans before the oil runs out, unless, among other things, there is a massive, say start with a $100 billion bailout, very sustained bailout with your money to keep the industry from going under. And I don't see any prospect of that. It's just too much money. Given that background, suppose our government does 3 things. Suppose, first of all, we say that however much we love nuclear power, we love the market even more. That is, we will accept its verdict. We will not bail out this technology. We'll design an orderly terminal phase for this unfortunate aberration. But we will try to make the market, such as it is, more efficient, so that these resources continue to be rapidly recycled, as is already happening, into the tasks of a soft path, because they make more sense. Secondly, that we will freely, unconditionally, non-discriminatorily help any other country that wants to do the same thing, perhaps with the moral sense of Atoms for Peace, but a bit more common sense. Third, that we will link those efforts with whatever we can do on the slower and more difficult task of mutual strategic arms reduction, treating them at least as interrelated parts of the same problem with intertwined solutions. Now, nobody can guarantee that this 3-part approach to the proliferation problem would be fully successful. But there is a growing feeling in the arms control community that it is much more likely to work than anything else we've thought of, and that accepting as a fait accompli and building on the market failure of the nuclear enterprise is an absolute necessity for any effective non-proliferation policy. The last comparison I want to make between these 2 paths And the one which, as I mentioned earlier, really defines the difference between them is political. Because each of these paths entails difficult political problems of very different kinds. In the hard path, such problems as centrism, autarky, vulnerability, technocracy. In the soft path, the problems of pluralism, getting used to the idea of doing with hundreds of millions of individual choices, using perhaps the market to which we profess devotion, doing with those what we would otherwise have done with a few big projects run from Washington. Getting used to the idea that in a country or a state this big and this diverse, with an energy problem as fine-grained as the one we've got, central management is much more part of the problem than part of the solution, perhaps a traumatic adjustment for central managers. I think we can't imagine any kind of energy future that's free of social problems. What we have to do is choose which kinds of problems we prefer. And it seems to me that those of a soft path, although perhaps less familiar, are a lot more tractable than the increasingly familiar and unpleasant problems of a hard path. And the soft path problems get easier as we go, not harder. Indeed, I'd contend that the social and economic advantages of a soft path are so great that if we let them show themselves, it would largely implement itself through existing market and political process. And to get that ball rolling, we need to do three main things. First of all, to clear away, mainly at state and county and local level, a long, messy list of institutional barriers, market imperfections, if you like, that impede efficiency in soft technologies. Things like 3,000 obsolete building codes, obsolete mortgage regulations, restrictive utility practices, inequitable access to capital. I think there's a neat answer to that one. The fee structure of the architects who designed this building. Split incentives between builders and buyers or between landlords and tenants. It's a long, messy list. If we aren't smart enough to solve those problems, I don't think we'll be smart enough to solve the much more formidable institutional problems looming in a hard path. Secondly, mainly at federal level, we ought to stop spending about $100 billion a year in tax and price subsidies trying to make conventional fuels and power look cheaper than they really are. That's a very expensive kind of self-deception, which has already brought us to the point where the California 55% solar tax credit cannot compete with the larger federal tax subsidies being offered to things like Alaskan gas. That's obviously nuts. Third, we ought to move gradually and fairly, as I think we know how, towards pricing all depletable fuels and indeed depletable resources at long-run replacement cost. Not doing that is just a sophisticated way of stealing from our children. Now, it will not be easy to do any of those three things, but I think it will be easier than not doing them. And that if they're handled right, a soft path can have a lot of political appeal, because unlike a hard path, it offers simultaneous advantages for almost every constituency. It offers, for example, jobs for the unemployed, capital for business people, otherwise their capital goes to energy and they never see it again, savings for consumers, chances for small business to innovate and for big business to recycle itself, environmental protection for conservationists, better national security for the military, exciting technologies for the secular, a rebirth of spiritual values for the religious, world order and equity for globalists, energy independence for isolationists, radical reforms for the young, traditional virtues for the old, civil rights for liberals, local autonomy for conservatives. It's true that it doesn't quite coincide with the perceived short-term interests of a few powerful institutions which have not yet grasped its opportunities and therefore wrongly see it as a threat. But I think it does run with, not across, the political grain of what is still mainly a Jeffersonian country. And it cuts through the kinds of ideological disputes that are now stalling energy policy. For example, in the Senate, we've just seen a year and a half of wrangling saying that before we could have even part of the beginnings of an energy policy, we'd have to agree on things like price versus regulation, capitalism versus socialism, Hamilton versus Jefferson, the role of the oil companies, the future shape of our whole society. We will never, thank heaven, agree about any of those things. Life would be awfully dull if we did. But if we try to make them a prerequisite to energy policy, hell will freeze over first, maybe literally. Whereas in a soft path, those kinds of disputes become pretty irrelevant, because if you're an economic traditionalist and the thing you most care about is lowest private internal cost, what's cheapest for you, then you can go ahead and build your solar collector because it's cheaper than not doing it. If you're a worker, you might build it because it gives you far more and better jobs than building power stations. If you're a conservationist, you might build it because it's benign. If you're a social transformationalist, you might build it because it's autonomous, but you see, it's still the same collector. You don't have to agree before or after about why you built it. It's motive-free. And we have in this country an overwhelming consensus that energy husbandry and soft technologies are desirable. They're a good way to go. We have no consensus on anything else in energy, so maybe what we ought to do is add up the bits we agree about because they're enough, and then we can forget the bits we don't agree about because they'll be superfluous. We've never tried before to design an energy policy around consensus, but I think it's time we started. And yet the time left us to do that is short, because although each of these illustrations embraces infinite variations on a theme, there is no single hard or soft path, I think there is a sense in which these two broad patterns are mutually inconsistent, mutually exclusive. Now, I do not mean by that, as some people have supposed, that hard and soft technologies are technically incompatible, because clearly they're not. There's nothing technical to stop you from putting solar panels right on top of Duane Arnold. Indeed, in a soft path, you'd start off with a bunch of hard technologies, you'd end up with a bunch of soft ones. In between, they'd coexist side by side for 50 years as their mix gradually shifted. But that shift would take place within a social and political context that gives rise, I think, to three kinds of exclusivity. First of all, a cultural one. Each of these worlds simply makes the other world harder to imagine. Where we are now is a great example. There are a lot of people running around, maybe a few tonight even, right here, who cannot imagine any approach to the energy problem except what they've been doing for the past 30 years, just because of this cultural conditioning. Second, each of these paths builds up around it a thick layer of organizations, laws, habits, policy actions that get in the way of the other. Just as today, a lot of institutional barriers left over from cheap oil are locking us into where we've been, not where we might want to go. Third, these paths compete for resources. Every bit of work and skill and political attention, every dollar, every barrel of oil, most precious, every year, which we put into these very demanding hard technologies, is a resource we cannot also use to do the tasks of a soft path urgently enough so they hang together. Because the timing matters. And I think in this sense, things like coal gasification and nuclear power are not only unnecessary, they're a positive encumbrance whose resource commitments threaten to push this soft technology wedge so far off into the future that before we can get to it, the fossil fuel bridge to it has literally been burned. So I think we ought, with due deliberate speed, to be choosing one or the other of these broad patterns before one has foreclosed the other, or before proliferation has foreclosed both. We ought to be asking where we could get to in 50 years or so and then working back to see how to get there smoothly, rather than continuing blindly by incremental adhocracy, one power station at a time, not asking where we're going, because anyway, that's after the next election. We ought to be using those relatively cheap fossil fuels thriftily to capitalize the transition as nearly as possible straight to our ultimate energy income technologies, because once the cheap fuels are gone, we won't have another chance to get there. Now, I can't, in a general talk of this kind, do justice to a very rich technical background, and that wasn't my intention. But the impression I hope I've left you with is that the really big, difficult, important, exciting issues in energy policy are not at all too complex or technical for ordinary people to understand, although they may well be too simple and too political for many technical experts to understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amory. Henry could field some questions here for a while, and if somebody has a hard exam tomorrow, if you'd like to slip out, we'll go ahead and do so. But he'd be glad to answer some questions.